Let's go. We are playing with the black pieces here. Let's appreciate it, guys. Now, I've been playing the King's Indian almost exclusively, but in this game, I want to play something a little bit different. I want to play something a little bit more solid, and I want to show you guys how to play more solidly. Let's play the Slav. Let's play the Slav, knight c6. The Slav is a form of the Queen's Gambit declined, where you don't take the pawn. Instead, you protect it with the c-pawn. And now we accept it with d takes c4. This is one variation of the Slav. John Bartholomew likes this line. Now, what is the idea? Essentially, the way to understand it is this. White goes a4 to stop b5. So white's going to play e3, and he's going to recapture the pawn. We shouldn't try to cling to that pawn. Rather than trying to cling to that pawn, what we should do is develop our pieces in as free and coordinated a fashion as possible, which means let's get the bishop outside the pawn chain. Remember, don't go e6 here. That bishop remains inside the pawn chain. Let's get it outside the pawn chain. And if we're keenly aware of what white does, where does this bishop belong? Noticing, by the way, which weaknesses white has created with his last move. Where does this bishop belong? Bingo. And this is theory. Bishop b4, exploiting the weakness created by a4. No rocket science here. We're making natural developing moves. And now we need to develop this knight, d7 being the only available square. But I like this, right? It's connecting to the other knight. This is still theory. Now, the main line here is queen e2 to prepare e4. Let's see if he knows it. There's many, many moves here. Queen b3 also possible. I actually know this line fairly well. He goes h3, which is a little bit of an empty move. No need for us to modify our strategy. We can complete our development by castling. And he goes knight h4. That was his idea. He is going to end up taking this bishop, but that's not a problem because he's wasted a bunch of moves on the taking of this bishop. Now, here's an important question. Should we leave the bishop on f5, or should we drop the bishop to g6? There is a very important logical chain that we need to apply here. We actually should leave the bishop on f5. Why? You guys might say, wait a second, what? What are you saying? I can see why you lost to Elshan. What are you talking about? Nonsense. He's going to take on f5. He's going to ruin your pawn structure. But give this a little bit more thought. Give this a little bit more thought. Let's go knight b6, expanding a little bit. Once he takes on f5, and we take back, our pawn on f5 is going to clamp down on his center. It's going to control the e4 square. And we're going to create this very nice pawn mass on the king side where each pawn defends its neighbor. We're going to go g6, and the f5 pawn is going to be defended. So essentially, it's another form of clamping down at the cost of, yes, slightly ruining our pawn structure, but ever so slightly. Just one pair of double pawns never really hurt anybody. And that is an inconsistent move because he's actually letting us trade bishops and his knight gets misplaced. So he's wasting a lot of time here doing a whole lot of nothing. Now we should continue making marginal improvements to our position. The reason that the Slav is not to everyone's liking is that even if white plays in mediocre fashion, black is not going to have an immediate blow. Now, what is white threatening here? What I don't want to allow is the move a5. I don't want to let white push his pawn to a6 and introduce defects in our queen side. So what should we do? Yeah, we should play a5 because not only does it stop a5, it cements the bishop on kind of an outpost. It's not really in the center, but it's a good square. Now, let's think about what do we want to do here? And a lot of people struggle in a position like this. But there's no need to struggle because the default approach in a situation like this is to continue making marginal improvements to your position. And one move that I really like here, the fact is the queen is undefended. We can see here, Malcolm, I actually love your move, c5. The bishop is on an outpost. I know this move looks a little awkward, but remember, his bishop is locked behind the pawn chain. So our pieces, in a sense, are more active than his, which means that opening up the position even a little bit should be in our favor. And we're not doing anything dry. Yeah, okay, so he put a knight on an outpost, not a big deal. Now we're going to bring our rook into the game with rook c8. Why are we putting it on a closed file? Because I am assuming that eventually we're probably going to take on d4 and the file is going to open up. Okay? So hopefully everything I'm doing is making sense. Now, which piece can we improve further? What should we do here? If we look at the queen, does the queen have a nice place somewhere toward the center? It actually does. Yeah, we can go c4 here. That would be interesting. We can go knight d5. Yeah, so we can go queen d5, we can go knight d5. Let's go queen d5. Potentially preparing rook f to d8. We are increasing our pressure on the center. Our opponent is playing very well. He's not doing anything terribly wrong, but I feel like he's starting to slip. And in openings such as the Slav, you make these marginal improvements. We take toward the center, right? We take toward the center. We don't take with the C pawn because we want to maintain pressure on the D4 pawn. Speaking of maintaining pressure on the D4 pawn, what should we do now? Well, one thing that we can take a second to do is to take care of our back rank. Yeah, let's go rook FD8 first. But at some point, it might be a good idea to play G6 and ensure that our back rank is not weak because he has already played H3. I don't want to give him that unfair advantage. Okay, so A5. How do I think of a move like this? A lot of people here would just want to move the knight. But wait a minute. What do I notice about this move? What I notice about this move is that it leaves the B5 knight undefended. If only we could exploit that. And we combine that with the observation that that queen on D3 is vulnerable. We can go C4, intermediate move, exposing the attack on the knight. That's why we put the queen on D5. And if he takes, our knight from B6 evades capture and takes D4, intercepting white's queen's control of the knight. His knight is going to be in big trouble here. He needs to respond very carefully to avoid losing a piece. He needs to be very careful to avoid losing. He does have a way to do that. Let's see if he finds it. He's still going to be in quite a bit of trouble if he does that, but let's see. Yeah, this is a pretty sexy move. The Albin is pretty decent, actually. It doesn't get enough love, I think. It's a pretty good opening for certain players. Okay, so he hasn't found the best move. And now we can take the knight. He takes our knight. And here it's very important to be patient. Don't just grab the pawn. Try to find the best intermediate move first. How can we... Malcolm Tucker is absolutely right. Of course, this is kind of a no-brainer. We could have also taken the pawn, but then we would have had tripled pawns on the b-file. Now we can take b6. We are up a pawn, and we're basically winning here. Now we just need to show good technique. Let's not forget to take care of our back rank, particularly since he's going to double. I don't want to have to deal with this crap at some point in the future. What's going to be our plan here? Well, what I'm annoyed by is this rook. So what we're going to do here, and first of all, this knight. And this knight wants to swing to d3. That's a very good move, actually. Very good move. So let's get our queen somewhere civilized. And how should we defend this pawn? We have the move knight to d5. If he goes to e4, he weakens the d4 square. That's going to be fatal for him. And what he should do is go rook fa1. That requires a lot of maturity, though. That requires a lot of maturity. Let's see if he does it. I'm a little bit low on time. So if he goes rook fa1, this is actually not quite as easy to win as I had initially anticipated. He's done a very good job defending this so far. But maturity not in like the behavioral sense, although that too. And he does it. I'm going to go rook c7 in order to protect the 7th rank. I anticipate... Okay. So should we trade rooks? Should we trade rooks? Monsi thinks prime. Absolutely we should. You guys are making the same mistake that I described, right? It's not like a test question where you're like, okay, this stupid guy thinks this. Is he right? And the answer is always no. I'm asking you not from that perspective. Let's go b5 to chase the rook away. And now what is our plan going to be here? I want somebody to describe the plan to me and to tell me how to accomplish this plan. Quickly. Our plan should be simplified, which means to trade off the second pair of rooks. And we should do that in the interest of time. I'm going to start moving by going queen b6. And now we're going to go rook a7. Why are we trading the other pair of rooks? Because once the rooks are gone from the board, it's going to be a lot easier for us to exploit that passed pawn. And now we're going to do that by trying to dislodge the queen from c2. We're going to go queen to b2. And instead of going c2, we're going to first take on f2. I'll delve into the reasons behind this after the game, given that I'm a little low on time. I do want to play a little bit faster here. And I will worry not. I will explain everything after the game. Basically, I'm eliminating issues. So now we can go knight e4. And if he takes the knight, that's actually kind of a sexy move. We go c2. And the knight cannot stop the pawn. And he resigns. Good game. Okay. That was a very good game. I mean, he did not fold over easily. And this is the reason why the Slav is an acquired taste, because as you guys could see, even if white was playing kind of in mediocre fashion, we were very solid, but it's hard for black to win the game in one fell swoop. Very hard for black to win like the game immediately, if you know what I'm saying. Okay. So the Slav. So basically, DC, the other move in this position is to play e6. By the way, this is called the Semi-Slav. And this creates like the pawn triangle. I think it's also called the triangle system. And the drawback of this is that it blocks in the bishop on c8. But this leads to some very, very complex lines. But d takes c4 is simpler. And if white goes e4, then black goes b5. It's hard to recover the pawn. That's why a4 is played in these positions. So bishop f5, e3, e6. Bishop takes c4. Now bishop b4. I explained these moves, right? We developed the bishop to the square that has been weakened by his move a4. So knight b7, h3. We castle. Knight h4. And now knight b6. So bishop d3 was poor. He should have gone bishop b3 and stuck to his plan. So just to recap, the fact of the matter is, what are the drawbacks of this move? There are two. The first is we obviously double our pawns. And second of all, we do, his bishop gets a little bit more active. But on the flip side, our pawn exerts tremendous control over the e4 square. And in combination with a knight on d5, we could potentially really clamp down on him by putting our knights on these two squares. I hope that makes sense. And also we can defend the pawn by playing g6. That's going to be, generally speaking, black's main plan. Does that make sense? No, that's not bad. So he goes bishop d3. No, I don't think you should trade bishops. Now we go a5 to cement the bishop. Spicy brings his knight back. And now c5, opening up the center. Why do we open it up? Because our pieces are more active than our opponent's pieces. Okay, knight b5 rook c8. So basically, okay, bishop d2. A lot of people here would trade the bishop. That's an instinct that people just have to remove, right? Because it's not a good idea to trade the bishop that's on an outpost for a bishop that's on d2. That's like voluntarily, getting your dental filling removed. Like that bishop on b4, an outpost also functions to uphold the weaknesses behind it, right? In a certain sense, you can think of it as, it's like the Tay Bridge collapse. One of my favorite gruesome, well, not favorite, that's the wrong word. A very gruesome historical event, the collapse of the Tay Bridge. It's a very interesting story. In Scotland in the 1870s, there was an architect, I think his name was Thomas Buff, and a Scottish, I think this was Edinburgh or Glasgow, I don't remember, one of the Scottish cities, they wanted to build a bridge, the Tay Bridge. They wanted it to be good. So they come to Dr. Buff, and let me actually get the name straight, one sec. I think it's like Bouse or something, Dundee, Scotland. So let me get the name straight, because I hate making stuff up. So basically, yeah, so Sir Thomas Bouch. So they come to Sir Thomas Bouch, and they commission him to build the bridge that carries trains across the Firth of Tay between the city of Dundee and a suburb. They wanted it to be good, and he works on it, and they build the bridge. And then on 28th of December, 1879, there's a fierce storm that happens in Dundee. Very fierce storm, huge wind, but the trains still run. And tragically, because this guy slacked off and this guy didn't do his homework, there were certain architectural defects that he knew about, and the bridge collapsed while it had a train on it. Literally, like the top half of the bridge collapsed and the train went right into the water. And this was a pretty famous historical event. Let's just say that guy did not have a good time. And there's a famous photograph that was taken after the collapse. It was a very famous photo that was taken after the collapse of the Tay Bridge, which looks like this. You can see that just like half of it is gone. And that's where the train collapsed into the water. This is like 1870s. Yeah, the people unfortunately perished. So not to use that as a tool to explain the speedrun, but to use that as a tool to explain the speedrun, think of the bishop on b4 as the Tay Bridge. If you take on d2, And outposts in general are like a bridge. Outposts protect weaknesses that are left behind the outposts. And if you give up the bishop, these pawns on a5 and c5, which looked really good, are now incredibly weak. Okay, sorry, that's a pretty out there analogy, but I really want to make this important point. You shouldn't have the default to like take a piece when a trade is offered. Okay, so a new bridge was built, and that bridge did not collapse. So queen d5. Bishop takes b4, a takes b4, capturing toward the center, keeping the pawn on c5 to pressure d4. Thank you. Rook f8, improving the rook. And now a5 was the big mistake. This was the decisive mistake because it leaves the knight unprotected and he misses a tactic. What should white have done here? Probably just improved his own position with rook a7. I think white is fine here. It's a game. Maybe black is a little bit better, but after a5, c4, the knight gets caught in the crossfire. The move queen e2 would have been superior to queen d2. The reason why is that here we do not have the move c3. In fact, the queen is pinned. So at least white preserves relative material balance. Black is still better though. So queen d2, queen b5, now c3, we win the pawn, and we get a huge protected passer. Now, Spicy played well here, but ultimately we trade rooks because we're up a pawn and we have a passer. When we have a passed pawn like this, we want to get the game into the endgame. And now the key idea, b5. Why? We want to get the rook to a7. Why? We want to trade rooks. Why do we want to trade rooks? As I just explained, we want to simplify because passed pawns are most important in the endgame. And that's exactly what we do. Now we get the queen to b2, dislodging the queen from c2. And now, why didn't we play c2? Could somebody explain to me why this doesn't just promote the pawn? It actually does. But this leads to unnecessary complications. This is an important point. So it's not knight d3 because then we just win the knight. It's actually check. And notice that black's queen is all of a sudden out of the game. That's like Timur Garayev's queen from my game. And all of a sudden, I don't think it's possible to avoid perpetual. In fact, in many cases, if you watch endgames, you can actually allow black to promote. And I actually think white might almost be winning here. White has this huge attack, and black actually has no checks, despite the fact that he's got two queens. So be careful about assuming that the game is over when you've promoted a second queen. Be very careful about that. Sometimes even with two queens, the king is relatively insulated against this. And black is actually losing here. I've confirmed it with the computer. So, be careful about that. That's why we take on f2, so that this queen could bring itself back to f6, take care of the king first. And now we can, with a single mind, Spicy with 800 bits, and we simply promote. 94, by the way. Nice little detail. If c2, then he goes knight d3, stopping the pawn. So 94 derails his knight from c5. Get it? And if he had taken the knight, we go c2 and we win the game. Okay. Moving right along, 200 bits. Thank you. Moriam, GM. We're playing a GM. Okay. Now, let's play the modern. I've played this, I think, once before. I want to showcase how to play hyper-modern openings. Now, this is the sort of cousin of the perk. It often transposes into the perk, and he plays bishop c4. Okay. So, in this position, we, of course, want to develop the knight. What is wrong with this move, ladies and gentlemen? And maybe I should have done this against Elshan. Trusted myself. Practice what I preach. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the free pawn. No reason not to take it. He just autopiloted it. Don't autopilot when your opponent plays unusual openings. Now, very important to react accurately here. How should we react? What are the possibilities here? There are several good ways. We can play d5 to cement the knight on the e4 square. And I actually quite like this move. Okay. We can build up a little pawn chain, or we can cover with the bishop, but let's build up the pawn chain. Now, what should we do here? What would be in the spirit of, well, actually, okay, so here's where a lot of people would slip up. A lot of people would be tempted, I think, to play bishop f5. But the problem with bishop f5, I called it, is white is this very nasty move, knight to h4. Okay? And that knight attacks the bishop, and the entire construction threatens to topple over. So let's invite Harry Nelson Pillsbury, and let's let Mr. Pillsbury do some talking. This is the Pillsbury knight. remember what I always say, pawns are the best defender of a piece. When a pawn defends a piece, that piece is very stable. White can try to go f3 in the future, but guess what? White's already castled, so a move like f3 might end up in disaster. Do we take the knight? Do we have to do anything here at all? Nah, just castle. Just develop. Same spirit. Okay, now we have a very good move. What am I seeing here? I'm seeing the knight. This is a type 2 undefended piece. Which means that it's only protected by one piece. So what my brain immediately notices here is the fact that the queen x-rays the knight through the lens of the pawn. Let's move that pawn out, simultaneously occupying the center. That's the great thing about the pill. Oh, thank you for the knight. Okay, this guy is really not having his best day. He blunders the knight, but already white was basically lost. And that is the game. Okay. Well, that was a quickie. Won't take us long to analyze. So queen e2 here, by the way, is the main move. As far as I know, you do need to defend the pawn. That is not a bad idea. But our opponent yielded that pawn. Now, the only really important moment here was this position. I'm sure bishop f5 was fine, but I was a little bit scared of the move knight h4, guys. What's the problem here with black? Why is this even an issue? Well, the problem is, let's say we castle, right? He plays knight takes f5, and we have to get this very nasty pawn structure. You might argue, well, isn't this a Pillsbury knight? Well, it is. But now we've given him like this h5 square for his queen. No need to ruin our pawn structure like that. So knight h4 is not a big issue, but f5 is a more stable way to defend the knight, in my opinion. So knight g5, we simply castle. Obviously, we don't take the knight. That would defeat the whole purpose of putting it on e4. In fact, that would be very bad for black. And if he goes f3, we actually just take on d4 with devastating consequences to the king. And the funny thing is, if the king goes to f1, do we actually have to move the knight here? What would be black's best move, in other words? Borrowing from the game. What you guys should see here is the fact that the rook is x-raying the king, which means that the funny thing is he actually is not threatening the knight. We can still go e5 as if nothing was going on, because if he takes, he's literally going to get checkmated in the center of the board. That is literally what's going to happen. So this is a disaster. He played c3, and now e5 is a simple tactic, extending the attack on the knight. If he takes, we take with the f pawn to open the f file. We have a brilliant pawn mass, and we're up a pawn. Horrible position for white, but he at least should have done this. After bishop takes c4, we of course also take with the f pawn. We don't take with the d pawn, because that would also open up this diagonal. h6 would be the same idea in spirit, but it wouldn't carry the benefit of opening up the center. And that's what's important about that move. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. So let me see here. Yeah. Okay, any questions? How about d5 instead of d6? What if he tries to cement his knight on e5? It's a pretty weak square. Well, if he tries to cement his knight on e5, we can assail it with knight d7, right? We have plenty of pieces that are guarding that square. That's a great point. And we have to factor that in. When you play a move like f5, you absolutely have to factor in the fact that you're weakening e5, right? And that's just something you have to notice, but we notice it because we have plenty of pieces that are defending that square. So type 1 undefended piece, right? Type 1 undefended piece is a piece that is not defended by any other pieces or pawns. A defended piece is a piece that is defended by either a pawn or more than one pieces. Okay, we call that piece defended. Bishop on f4 would be a type 1 undefended piece. Nothing is defending it. Clear? Type 2 undefended piece, a piece that is only protected by exactly one other piece and not a pawn, right? So for example, here, I'm looking, bishop on g7 is type 1. Could you name a black piece that is a type 2 undefended piece? I love Elshan. He's great. He's a very, very nice guy and very classy, and, you know. Rook on h8, yes. Now, here's the thing, guys. Not every, yeah, knight on b8, bishop on c8. This idea loses its meaning if you indiscriminately kind of point to every piece and think, this piece is important. You have to exercise your judgment in terms of identifying the type 2 undefended pieces that might be vulnerable. Like the knight on b8 is not vulnerable. Well, it could be, But I would say the rook on h8 is less vulnerable than the knight or the bishop, right? The knight is made contact with by the bishop. So by definition, or at least using our judgment, we can conclude that it's more likely that there's going to be some sort of a tactic with the knight than with the rook. Well, Orpheus, well, that's where it gets into the tricky bit, right? If you're aware of the fact that you're making an undefended piece, that's already part of the process toward not blundering. Awareness is very important in chess, right? Blunders often happen precisely because we are unaware that a certain piece is vulnerable. So awareness will not always produce total lack of blunders. Nobody can eliminate blunders, but it's important. Let's move on.